My name is Wiley Cash, and this is my first novel, and it's a debut novel, and I have a weird name, and it's got a long title, and it's about the South, and it's got snake handling and speaking in tongues and all this crazy stuff in it. And so when the book was purchased, my editor, William Morrow, said, okay, listen, we have to make sure the independent bookstores get behind this book, because they are the ones who are going to carry a book like this. It is going to be up to them to decide whether it sinks or swims. And so I like to think the book is swimming right now, and I know that is in part because of places like Fiction Addiction and booksellers like Jill, and I really appreciate the support they've given me. And William Morrow and HarperCollins knows how important these stores are, not only to books like mine, but to communities like Greenville. So I want to thank you for investing in me and for investing in your community. And I also want to talk very briefly about literacy. I'm so proud to be here with some members from the Greenville Literacy Association. And my wife and I have been really lucky over the past couple of years, not just because of this book, but just in our lives in general. Most of us have. And we were looking for a way that we could somehow give back, or try to give back, to a reading community that has given me, not only a life in terms of trying to be an author. I'll check back in a year, I'll let you know how that's going, but also a reading life. During the most difficult times of my life, I can remember what I was reading. And I can't imagine not having the ability to step away from what's going on in my real life and step into the pages of the book, whether it's fiction or nonfiction or whatever the case may be. And to think that a lot of adults in our community, not just children, but adults in this community don't have that ability is shocking to me. The illiteracy or under-literacy rates in South Carolina for adults are as high as 15%. That means 15% of the people of Greenville perhaps couldn't read this book. These pages would be blank to them. And it complicates the world for them, because now they have to memorize what labels look like in the grocery store. They can't read the warning labels on their prescriptions. They have to make up bedtime stories to their children and dread the day when their children can read the books that they can. And so I'm so thankful to be partnering with these people, and I encourage you guys to maybe donate to them as well, or donate your time. It's just as important, volunteer hours. So thank you all so much for letting me be a part of what you're doing. As Jill said, I'm from North Carolina and very proud to be so. I grew up in Gastonia. I was born in Gastonia, roughly, in Fayetteville, in Gastonia 6 months later. And I went to school in Asheville. And I love Western North Carolina. It's where I feel most at home. I was in Asheville this past weekend. My wife came down from West Virginia, and we're just walking the streets of town. I feel so alive there, and I feel so comfortable there. But I had to leave it in 2003. I went down to graduate school in Lafayette, Louisiana. And I realized that the South in Lafayette, Louisiana is very different than the South in Asheville, North Carolina. And if y'all been to Asheville, you know the South in Asheville is very different than the South in Greenville, South Carolina. So when people say the South, that's an incorrect statement. They should be saying the Souths. And the next question should be, which South are you talking about? So when I got down to Lafayette, I found a place where the accents were strange, the food was strange, the weather was strange. They only had summer and like a week of spring and like an afternoon of fall, and the rest was just, terrorizing heat and humidity. And I got down there and realized how desperately homesick I was for North Carolina. And I began to reread the works of North Carolina writers I love. People like Ron Rash, who I know will be here next week on Thursday, right?
This Thursday.
This Thursday. So I'm kind of his warm-up act. I'm like the college band who opens for the Rolling Stones, and I'm just happy to be here. But I started reading Ron stuff, and I went back and read Thomas Wolfe's book Homered Angel, which is a book that I've always loved. I read some Gail Godwin and Woman Dykeman's The Tall Woman, which is set in Western North Carolina. And I even read Eastern North Carolina writers like Clyde Edgerton and Kay Gibbons. Anything I could to get back to North Carolina, to get back in that state. I'd always listened to bluegrass music, but now I listen to it kind of for the first time. And I did anything I could to re-immerse myself in the world I left behind. During that time, that first semester there, I was taking a class in African American literature, and my professor brought in a news story out of Chicago, Illinois, where a young African-American boy had been smothered during a healing service at a storefront church on the south side. And I was really taken aback by that story because of its tragedy obviously, but I was also really interested in that because I've always been intrigued by evangelical movements, especially the holiness movement, the Pentecostal movement, and I was curious about a group of believers who would believe something to death. This boy, they tried to lay hands on him and heal him, and he fought them because he didn't want to be touched, and so they laid across his body and pinned him to the floor and ended up crushing him and killing him. And I wanted to try to tell that young boy's story, but I'd never been to Chicago. I knew I couldn't speak for the African-American community on the south side, so I just kind of let the story kind of languish on the back shelf of my mind for a while. That semester, I was also taking a class under a writer named Ernest Gaines, which is the reason I went to Lafayette to begin with. I wanted to go as far into the American South as I could, and I wanted to study under Ernest Gaines. He wrote A Lesson Before Dying and the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman, and all these wonderful books about the Deep South. But he was born on a plantation in 1933, where his family were slaves and then sharecroppers. And he had to leave in 1948 because there were no schools for African-American children beyond elementary school. And he moved out to California to join his mother and his stepfather, who was in the Merchant Marine. And his stepfather was a real strict disciplinarian. And he told young Ernest, he said, "Boy, you got two places you can go. You can go to the gym or you can go to the library." And he'd never been allowed to go to a library in his life because in New Rose, Louisiana, it's the Jim Crow South. He couldn't go to the public library. So he thought, well, that makes me uncomfortable. I'll go to the gym. And he said he walked into a gym, somebody invited him to box, and they blooded his nose immediately. And he said he was in the ring trying to take the gloves off his hands with his teeth. And so he said he hightailed it to the library. And when he got there, he said, you know, I miss home. I miss the big oak trees. I miss the sugarcane fields. I miss the swamps. He said, I'm going to go in this library and I'm going to read every book by and about African Americans living in Louisiana. And he went into the library and realized those books weren't there, they didn't exist at that time. And so he decided he would write them. And he says he's still writing those books as an homage to his people and the place that he's from. And so here I am in the Deep South in Louisiana, desperately homesick. I've been delivered this great story, this tragic story about this young boy in Chicago. And I'm studying fiction writing under this, the South's greatest living writer, writing about home while not being at home. And I feel something, like this idea working in my head. And I imagine a little light bulb the size of one of those light bulbs that's on Christmas tree lights, like flicking off and on. And I'm like, you're trying to tell me something, but what is it? And I suddenly realized that I'd never been to Chicago, but I could take that story and I could put it in North Carolina. And I could do two things. I could tell a story about a community that I knew, and I could go home when I did it. And so that was the real reason that I wrote this book. It was because I felt compelled to tell this little boy's story and the story of the community, but I was also homesick. And when I sat down to write, I got to write about mountains and fresh water and snow and music, and I could hear people's voices. And the result of that is this novel. And it's based, the title is based, or is taken from the closing lines of Thomas Wolfe's You Can't Go Home Again, which is kind of ironic. I'm a big Thomas Wolfe fan, as I said. But You Can't Go Home Again is about a young man who writes his first novel about his home state in a time of great global economic difficulty, and everyone hates it. And so I told my editor, I was like, are you sure this is the best title? Are we setting ourselves up for a repeat performance of what's going on in this novel? But we went with it, and it always felt right. But another funny story, the day the book came out, my wife and I had just moved to Morgantown. We didn't really know anybody in that part of West Virginia. And so when I came home from work, she had decorated our house with balloons and confetti and stuff, and it was really sweet. And she had ordered me a first edition of You Can't Go Home Again. So that was really nice. So that was one of my gifts. And the other gift was a suitcase, which I thought, you give somebody a book called You Can't Go Home Again, and then you give them a suitcase, and I thought, what message are you trying to send? She was like, no, it's for your tour, but you can fit all your clothes in there. Literally, all of them. Are you sure you're not? But so the central action of this novel is the fallout in a small mountain community after a young boy is smothered during a healing service. And the young boy, he can't speak, so I knew he couldn't tell this story. You know, he's not only mute, but he's also a victim. And so I knew that I had to create a community to tell the story, because this is the community story. Southern literature has a long history of multi-voiced narratives, and I'm in no way comparing myself to Faulkner or Gaines or any writer like that, but those were the models I had going into this. And so I really looked at what they did and how they succeeded, and I tried to adapt it to my own purposes. So I created 3 characters. One is the younger brother of the autistic boy. His name is Jess. He's 9 years old, and he knows something about this event. He knows the truth behind why this happened and how this happened. And he harbors this horrible guilt about his own role in his brother's death. The second narrator is named Adelaide Law. She's 81 years old, local midwife. She's kind of the cultural conscience of the community. She's also a true believer in the faith that she proclaims. And she sees a church that's been threatened by this charismatic minister named Carson Chambliss. She was witness 10 years earlier to an event where a woman in the church was bitten during a snake handling service, and to hide that fact, they take the woman's body and leave it out in the garden to cover it up. So Adelaide realizes this is no place for children to be when all this is going on, so she takes the children out of the church. And for 10 years they're safe until our young boy Christopher is called inside and tragedy results. The final narrator is named Clem Bearfield. He's a local sheriff with a touch of tragedy in his own past. He's an outsider in Madison County. He's only been living there for 25 years. Jane was telling me she was in Mars Hill, so she probably felt like that maybe sometimes. Mars Hill's a great community, though. He knows some things about Chambliss that Chambliss doesn't know he knows. He was involved, he spent some time in the state penitentiary down in Georgia for a meth lab explosion in which his body was burned up, and a young runaway girl from Mississippi was killed. He's recently found out about this woman named Molly Jameson that Chambliss helped cover up her death when she was bitten by that snake 10 years earlier. So he knows Chambliss is a bad guy. He knows there's been some stuff going on in this church out by the river with newspaper over the windows, but he can't quite put a finger to what it is. But he knows now that a young boy has died, that he needs to get a hold of this guy and find out exactly what it was that led to this tragedy and why this little boy was there, why his mother would allow him to be there, and now suddenly why no one is willing to talk about what happened that day.